Ever wonder what happens when you trust your neighbors not to literally steal your property while you're gone? Hit that like button if you've ever returned from vacation to find someone's made themselves at home in your space. And drop a comment if you think HOAs should require basic geography lessons before they start managing communities. So there I was, 28 years old, fresh engineering degree in hand, and Singapore was calling my name with a 3-year contract that would set me up for life. The only problem? My grandfather's lake property in northern Michigan. 2 acres of pristine lakefront he'd left me, complete with a modest cabin that had seen better decades and a dock that creaked like my knees after leg day. The property sat right on the edge of Willowbrook, one of those neighborhoods where people moved to get away from it all, but somehow brought all their city neuroses with them. Most of the community was decent folks, but they had an HOA. Because apparently, even in the middle of nowhere, someone needs to tell you what color your mailbox can be. I'd been dealing with their president, Margaret Coleman Maggie Thornfield, for about 6 months before my departure. Maggie had that particular brand of confidence that comes from believing your community college business degree makes you a real estate mogul. She wore cardigans in July and had perfected the art of the passive-aggressive smile. You know, the one that says, "Bless your heart," but means, "I'm plotting your destruction." Before leaving for Singapore, I made sure everything was buttoned up tight. Property taxes paid 3 years in advance, insurance current, and I'd hired old Pete Sullivan from down the road to check on the place monthly. Pete was pushing 70, had arms like tree trunks from a lifetime of actual work, and possessed the rare gift of not giving a damn about HOA politics. "Don't you worry about nothing," Pete had said, spitting tobacco juice into a Folgers can with the precision of a sniper. "I'll keep an eye on things. That Maggie woman comes sniffing around. I'll set her straight." Famous last words, as it turns out. The first year went smooth as silk. Pete's monthly emails were brief but reassuring. All good. Maggie drove by twice. Doc's holding up. Caught a base yesterday. The man had a gift for economy of language that would make Hemingway weep with envy. Year 2 started getting interesting. Pete's emails began mentioning HOA meetings. Apparently, Maggie had been asking questions about abandoned properties and community improvement opportunities. I'd shoot back emails reminding Pete to forward any official correspondence, but nothing came through. Should have been my first red flag, but I was busy building bridges in tropical paradise and assuming adults could act like adults. The real fun started in year 3, about 18 months ago. Pete's emails became creative. "Maggie's been real interested in your place lately. Brought some surveyor types around. Told them I was armed and dangerous." Mostly true. Then, "She's been talking about lakefront development at the community meetings. Might want to give her a call. But here's the thing about international projects. They eat your life. 14-hour days, 6-day weeks, and a time difference that made calling home feel like scheduling a NASA launch." I fired off a quick email to Maggie asking what was up and got back something about community enhancement studies and maximizing underutilized resources. Corporate speak for, "I'm up to something, but I'm not telling you what." Then Pete went quiet. His last email, dated 4 months ago, was uncharacteristically cryptic. "Situation's gone sideways. Call me." But when I tried calling, the line was disconnected. Pete's nephew told me he'd moved to Arizona after some disagreement with the neighbors. That should have sent me packing for the nearest flight home. Instead, I figured I'd deal with whatever small-scale nonsense Maggie had cooked up when my contract ended. Spoiler alert, it wasn't small-scale. I landed at Detroit Metro 3 days ago, jet-lagged and ready to spend a month fishing, reading, and pretending the outside world didn't exist. The drive up north felt like therapy, watching the suburbs fade into farmland, then forests, then the familiar winding roads that led home. But as I turned the final corner toward my property, something looked different. There were too many cars parked along the road. Too many people walking around. And was that a sign? Willowbrook Lakeside Retreat, premium vacation rentals. I pulled over, stepped out of my rental car, and stared. Where my modest cabin used to sit alone, there were now 4 identical wooden structures arranged in a neat little row. Each one had its own little porch, complete with rocking chairs and hanging flower baskets. There was a new gravel driveway, a fire pit area, and what appeared to be a small marina with kayaks and paddleboards. On my land. My grandfather's land. The land I'd been paying taxes on for 3 years while building bridges halfway around the world. And there, walking toward me with that same passive-aggressive smile I remembered, was Maggie Thornfield. She'd added some highlights to her hair and traded her cardigans for what I can only describe as rustic chic, like LL Bean had a baby with a Pottery Barn catalog. Well, she said, stopping about 10 feet away. Look what the cat dragged in. I stood there for a solid 30 seconds, my brain trying to process what my eyes were telling it. You know that feeling when you wake up from a really vivid dream and reality takes a moment to load? Except this wasn't a dream, and Maggie's smug expression was becoming more real by the second. Maggie, I said, proud that my voice came out steady instead of the strangled squeak I was expecting. Care to explain why there's a small resort on my property? She tilted her head like a confused golden retriever, except golden retrievers are actually endearing. Your property? Oh, honey, I think there might be some confusion here. Honey. She called me honey, in the tone you'd use with a child who'd just insisted that Santa was real and living in their closet. The confusion, I said, pulling out my phone to check that I hadn't somehow driven to the wrong lake, is why there are tourists roasting marshmallows where my grandfather's rocking chair used to be. Maggie's smile got wider, which should have been physically impossible, but somehow wasn't. Well, after you abandoned the property. I didn't abandon anything. I was working. In Singapore, where people build things instead of stealing them. The HOA had to take action to prevent the area from becoming an eyesore. Abandoned properties bring down everyone's home values, you know. I walked past her toward the nearest cottage, noting that someone had installed a rather lovely stone pathway. Professional work, too. This wasn't some weekend warrior project slapped together with Home Depot supplies and YouTube tutorials. Excuse me, called a voice from the cottage's porch. A middle-aged woman in yoga pants and a tank top that proclaimed her as #blessed to be here was waving at me. Are you the property manager? The hot water in Unit 3 isn't working properly. Unit 3. My family's land had been turned into a numbered accommodation system. I'll have someone look at that right away, Maggie called back cheerfully, then turned to me with a look that could have curdled milk. Let's continue this conversation somewhere more private, shall we? She led me away from the cottages toward what used to be the quiet end of my property. Even here, changes were obvious. The old fire pit where my grandfather and I used to burn brush had been expanded into a proper gathering area with log benches arranged in a circle. Someone had strung fairy lights between the trees. It looked like a Pinterest board titled Rustic Wedding Venue Goals. The community voted, Maggie began, settling onto one of the benches like she was holding court. After 18 months of no contact, I sent emails. You responded to exactly one of them. We determined that the property had been effectively abandoned under Michigan Statute 324.76-109. I had to give her credit. She'd done her homework, even if she'd apparently skipped the parts about due process and property rights. That statute requires a minimum 5-year abandonment period, Maggie. Also, abandonment requires intent, which is hard to prove when someone's been paying property taxes. Her smile flickered, just for a second, but I caught it. There were safety concerns, she continued smoothly. The old cabin was becoming structurally unsound. We had engineers assess it. Engineers you hired. The community hired. To condemn my property. To assess community safety risks. This was like playing tennis with someone who kept insisting the net was actually a decorative garden trellis. Every return shot got twisted into something completely different. And then, I said, gesturing toward the cottages, the community just happened to decide that the best solution was to build a vacation rental business? The Willowbrook Lakeside Retreat serves the entire community, Maggie said, her voice taking on the practiced cadence of someone who'd given this speech before. The revenue goes directly back into community improvements. New playground equipment, road maintenance, snow removal services. How generous of you to spend my land's earning potential on community projects. The HOA's earning potential, you mean. And there it was. The thing she'd been building toward this entire conversation. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Not fear, exactly, but the recognition that this was going to be a much bigger fight than I'd anticipated. Walk me through the legal theory here, Maggie. I'm curious how the HOA acquired title to privately owned land that was never part of your jurisdiction in the first place. She stood up, brushing invisible dirt off her artfully distressed jeans. I think you should speak with our attorney. Marcus Webb from Webb, Hartley and Associates in town. He handled the entire acquisition process. Due to the abandonment issues and community safety concerns, the HOA was forced to take emergency action. Mr. Webb can explain the details, but essentially, the community has assumed responsibility for the property until all outstanding debts and obligations are resolved. Outstanding debts. I was starting to understand the game now. What debts, Maggie? HOA dues, for starters. 3 years of unpaid dues, plus penalties and interest. Then there's the emergency assessment for the safety inspection, the cost of the environmental study. We had to make sure the old cabin hadn't leaked anything toxic into the lake, the demolition costs, site preparation, the new septic systems. She was counting on her fingers now, really getting into her rhythm. Oh, and the legal fees, of course. Mr. Webb's time isn't free. Each item hit like a separate slap. They hadn't just stolen my property. They'd built an entire financial justification for the theft, complete with invoices I'd never seen and fees I'd never agreed to. The total came to just over $87,000. Maggie continued brightly. The cottage rental income is slowly paying that down, but at the current rate, it'll take about, 12 to 15 years to clear the debt. 12 to 15 years. Long enough for any statute of limitations to expire, long enough for their emergency action to become established fact, long enough for my grandfather's legacy to disappear entirely into Maggie's community improvement fund. The scary part? She'd probably run this playbook before. You don't develop this level of detailed financial justification overnight. This was practiced, refined, perfected through repetition. One more question, I said. Where exactly did you think I was for 3 years? Did it occur to anyone that I might eventually come back? Maggie's smile returned to full wattage. Oh, we tried to reach you, of course. Sent registered letters to your last known address. Posted notices in the local paper, as required by law. When we didn't hear back, she shrugged elegantly. Well, we had to assume you'd moved on with your life. My last known address. The apartment I'd vacated 3 years ago when I left for Singapore. The apartment that had been listed as my forwarding address with exactly nobody, because I'd handled all my important mail forwarding through a digital service. They'd sent legal notices to an address they knew was defunct, published announcements in a paper I couldn't access from halfway around the world, and called it due process. It was brilliant, in a sociopathic sort of way. I spent that first night in a motel 20 minutes down the road, staring at the ceiling and listening to the air conditioner cycle on and off like a mechanical wheeze. Sleep was optional when your brain was busy cataloging all the ways you'd been outmaneuvered by someone who probably bought her law degree from a Cracker Jack box. Morning brought coffee that could strip paint and a newfound determination to figure out exactly how deep this rabbit hole went. First stop, the county clerk's office, where public records live and bureaucrats go to die. Linda Kowalski had been running the property records department since approximately the Mesozoic era. She remembered my grandfather, remembered when I'd inherited the land, and most importantly, remembered every single document that had been filed regarding my property over the past 3 years. You're not going to like this, she said, pulling out a folder thick enough to choke a horse. She was right. I didn't like it. The paper trail was impressive in its thoroughness and terrifying in its implications. Maggie hadn't just grabbed my land. She'd built an entire legal framework to justify the grab, complete with emergency HOA resolutions, environmental assessments, safety inspections, and court filings. Started about 18 months ago, Linda explained, spreading the documents across her counter like she was dealing tarot cards that predicted financial ruin. First was this emergency resolution declaring your property a community safety hazard. The resolution was 2 pages of official-looking nonsense about structural instability, potential environmental contamination, and immediate risk to community welfare. It was signed by all 7 HOA board members and notarized by Marcus Webb himself. Conflict of interest much? Then came the environmental assessment, Linda continued. Apparently, they found concerning levels of contamination from your grandfather's old workshop. My grandfather's workshop. The place where he'd built birdhouses and fixed lawn mowers for half the county. If there was environmental contamination there, it consisted of wood shavings and maybe some 30-weight motor oil. The contamination report recommended immediate demolition and soil remediation. I read aloud. Estimated cost, $47,000. Funny thing about that, Linda said, lowering her voice. My cousin Eddie runs the soil testing company they used. Says he never set foot on your property, but somehow his signature's on the report. Forged documents. It just kept getting better. The rest of the paper trail read like a masterclass in bureaucratic fraud. Emergency court orders filed in my absence, with service attempted at my old apartment address. Liens filed against the property for unpaid HOA dues. Dues I'd never owed because the property had never been part of the HOA in the first place. Legal fees that somehow doubled every month, as if Marcus Webb charged by the syllable. The final document transferred property management to the HOA, pending resolution of outstanding obligations, Linda said. Signed by Judge Patricia Fleming. Judge Patricia Fleming. I made a mental note to research her connection to the Willowbrook community. Linda, I said, gathering up copies of everything. Off the record, how often do you see this kind of creative property management? She looked around the empty office, then leaned closer. In 32 years? Never seen anything this sophisticated. Usually it's just neighbor disputes over fence lines or people trying to steal a few feet of waterfront. This is, she paused, searching for the right word. This is professional. Professional. That was exactly what worried me. My next stop was Pete Sullivan's old place. Maybe his nephew could provide some insight into what had happened during those final months. Tommy Sullivan was a younger, less grizzled version of his uncle, with the same suspicious squint and talent for tobacco spitting. He was working under the hood of a pickup truck that had seen better decades. Uncle Pete told me you'd probably show up eventually. He said without looking up from whatever mechanical problem he was solving with percussive maintenance. Said to tell you he was sorry he couldn't stick around for the fireworks. What happened, Tommy? He straightened up, wiping his hands on a rag that had given up trying to be clean sometime during the Clinton administration. Started with harassment. Maggie and her crew would drive by Pete's place 3 times a day, taking pictures, making notes. Then came the citations. Citations? Of course. What kind of citations? Every kind you can think of. Grass too long, mailbox the wrong color, excessive noise from Pete's workshop. They hit him with 17 violations in 2 months. I felt my jaw clench. Pete had lived in that house for 40 years. His mailbox had been the same blue since the Carter administration, and his workshop was quieter than a library compared to the actual construction noise coming from my stolen property. The final straw was when they tried to get his dogs declared dangerous, Tommy continued. Pete's got 2 ancient beagles that haven't moved fast enough to catch their own shadows in years. But somehow they were a threat to community safety. So he moved to Arizona. Had to. They were going to take his house next. Same playbook they used on you. Emergency assessments, legal fees, environmental concerns. Pete got out before they could finish the job. The pattern was becoming clear. Maggie didn't just steal properties. She eliminated obstacles. Pete had been protecting my land, so Pete had to go. How many other neighbors had received similar treatment? Tommy, do you know anyone else who's had problems with the HOA? His laugh was bitter as burnt coffee. You mean besides everyone? The Hendersons got hit with a $15,000 assessment for unauthorized landscaping. They planted tomatoes without permission. The Kowalski place, Linda's sister, got declared a fire hazard because their wood pile was 6 feet from the house instead of 8. What about allies? Anyone willing to stand up to Maggie? Most folks are too scared. But there might be one person. He looked thoughtful. Sarah Chun moved in about 2 years ago, right when this all started getting ugly. She's some kind of lawyer from Chicago, bought the old Brennan place for weekend getaways. Maggie tried the same intimidation tactics on her. And Tommy grinned, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him. Let's just say lawyers don't intimidate as easy as retired factory workers. Sarah told Maggie exactly where she could stick her HOA violations, in language that would make a sailor blush. Haven't heard a peep about her since. A lawyer, with recent experience dealing with Maggie's tactics. Maybe my luck was finally turning. I found Sarah Chen's place without trouble. It was the only house on Maple Street that didn't look like it was cowering in fear. The lawn was perfectly maintained, but not obsessively so. The mailbox was a cheerful red that probably violated at least 6 HOA regulations, and there was a sign by the front door that read, "Trespassers will be prosecuted to the full extent of the law, and possibly beyond." Sarah herself was about 40, with the kind of confident bearing that comes from winning arguments for a living. She answered the door wearing paint-splattered jeans and a t-shirt that proclaimed, "I'm not arguing. I'm just explaining why I'm right. You must be the guy whose property Maggie turned into her personal ATM," she said without preamble. "I've been wondering when you'd show up. Apparently, my reputation preceded me. Tommy Sullivan thought you might be willing to share some insights about our mutual friend. Our mutual parasitic infection, you mean? Come on in. I was just making coffee, and trust me, you're going to need it." Her kitchen was chaos of legal documents, empty pizza boxes, and coffee cups in various stages of abandonment. It looked like a law office had collided with a college dorm room. "I've been documenting Maggie's operation for 2 years, Sarah said, pouring coffee that looked strong enough to wake the dead. Started as self-defense, but it's turned into something bigger. What she's doing isn't just theft, it's systematic racketeering. She led me to a dining room table covered with files, photographs, and what appeared to be a conspiracy theory wall worthy of a Netflix crime documentary. The vacation rental business is just the tip of the iceberg," Sarah continued, pointing to a detailed financial chart. "She's been using the same playbook on properties all around the lake. Force out the owners, claim emergency management, then monetize the land through the HOA. The chart showed 7 properties that had undergone emergency management over the past 5 years. 7 families displaced, 7 pieces of prime lakefront real estate absorbed into Maggie's expanding empire. The revenue doesn't go back into community improvements like she claims," Sarah said. "It goes into a separate LLC she controls. Willowbrook Property Management, incorporated in Delaware for maximum corporate opacity. What's the end game?" Sarah's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "She's assembling a lakefront resort. Once she controls enough properties, she'll sell the whole package to a development company. I estimate she's looking at a $15 to $20 million payday. 15 to 20 million. My grandfather's 2 acres weren't just a theft. They were a small piece of a much larger con game." "Sarah," I said, looking at the mountain of evidence she'd assembled, "how would you like to help me burn this whole thing down?" Her smile got wider. "I thought you'd never ask." Planning revenge against someone who spent 3 years perfecting their scam requires a certain level of strategic thinking. Fortunately, Sarah Chun had been wargaming scenarios for 2 years and had developed what she called the nuclear option. "The problem with fighting Maggie directly," Sarah explained over her 4th cup of coffee, "is that she's built her whole operation on the assumption that her victims will either give up or fight her one-on-one. She's counting on you to hire some local attorney, file a property dispute, and spend the next 5 years bleeding money in court while she keeps collecting rental income. So we don't fight fair. We don't fight fair, and we don't fight alone." Sarah's plan was beautiful in its simplicity and terrifying in its scope. Instead of challenging just my property theft, we were going to expose the entire operation simultaneously. Every forged document, every fraudulent assessment, every illegal transfer would hit the legal system at once, creating a coordinated avalanche that Maggie couldn't possibly defend against. "Step 1, Sarah said, pulling out a thick folder, "is evidence. I've been collecting documentation on every property she's touched, every fraudulent filing, every forged signature. But I needed someone with standing to challenge the core property theft to make it all actionable. The evidence was staggering. Forged environmental reports, backdated HOA resolutions, falsified court documents, and financial records showing money flowing from the vacation rentals directly into Maggie's personal accounts. She'd been sloppy with her bookkeeping, probably assuming that nobody would ever be in a position to demand a full audit. Step 2 is allies. I've been in contact with every displaced property owner. Most of them are willing to fight if they know they're not fighting alone. Fear was Maggie's weapon. We're going to turn that around on her. By the end of the week, we had 6 property owners ready to file simultaneous lawsuits, a forensic accountant ready to tear apart Willowbrook Property Management's finances, and a private investigator who specialized in HOA fraud cases. Sarah had even found a process server who took personal satisfaction in delivering subpoenas to people who deserved them. Step 3, Sarah continued, is timing. We hit everything at once. Criminal complaints for fraud and forgery, civil suits for property theft and racketeering, regulatory complaints about the illegal rental operation, and tax fraud reports to the IRS. She won't know which fire to put out first. But the crown jewel of the plan was step 4, public humiliation. Maggie's entire operation depends on community support, Sarah explained. She's convinced everyone that she's protecting their property values and improving the neighborhood. Once people see what she's actually been doing, that support disappears. The community meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening at the Willowbrook Community Center. According to the agenda, Maggie planned to present the annual financial report and discuss exciting expansion opportunities for the Lakeside Retreat project. Perfect timing. I spent the intervening days gathering the last pieces of evidence. The county tax assessor's office provided documentation showing that Maggie had been claiming tax exemptions for community property while simultaneously reporting rental income to the state. The local Environmental Protection Office had no record of any contamination reports filed for my property, despite Maggie's claims of environmental hazards. Most damning of all, I found the smoking gun, Marcus Webb's billing records, obtained through Sarah's connections in the legal community. He'd billed the HOA for property acquisition services starting 6 months before any emergency resolutions were filed. The legal theft had been planned well in advance. Thursday evening arrived with the kind of crisp autumn weather that makes you believe in second chances. The community center was packed. Apparently, Maggie had done an excellent job drumming up attendance for what she probably thought would be a celebration of her entrepreneurial success. I arrived fashionably late, slipping in through the back door just as Maggie was beginning her presentation. She'd really dressed for the occasion, business casual with just enough lakeside casual to remind everyone that this was about community, not profit. The Willowbrook Lakeside Retreat has exceeded all expectations, she was saying, clicking through a PowerPoint presentation filled with photos of happy tourists and revenue projections. In just 18 months, we've generated over $200,000 in income for community improvements. Scattered applause from the audience. These people genuinely believed they were part of something good. Our expansion plans include 3 additional cottage units, a community dock upgrade, and a possible conference center for corporate retreats, Maggie continued. The property acquisition costs have been fully recouped, and we're now generating pure profit for community reinvestment. Property acquisition costs. She was actually bragging about stealing my land. That's when Sarah stood up. Mrs. Thornfield, Sarah said in her best courtroom voice, could you clarify which properties were legally acquired by the HOA for this retreat project? Maggie's smile flickered, but held. All properties were acquired through proper legal channels, following state and local regulations for abandoned property management. And by abandoned, you mean properties whose owners were working overseas? I mean properties whose owners failed to maintain community standards or respond to legal notices. Sarah moved closer to the front of the room, and I noticed several people shifting in their seats. Word had probably gotten around that Sarah wasn't someone to mess with. Mrs. Thornfield, are you aware that sending legal notices to addresses you know are vacant doesn't constitute proper service under Michigan law? I'm not sure what you're implying. I'm implying that you committed mail fraud by deliberately sending notices to defunct addresses, then claiming the property owners were unresponsive. The murmur that ran through the crowd sounded less supportive now. People were starting to pay attention, and not in a good way for Maggie. That's when I stood up. "Hi, everyone," I said, walking toward the front. "My name's David Morrison. My grandfather left me 2 acres of lakefront property 3 years ago. You probably know it better as Units 1 through 4 of the Willowbrook Lakeside Retreat." The silence was profound. I've been working in Singapore for 3 years, building bridges and paying property taxes. While I was gone, Mrs. Thornfield here decided to steal my land, forge environmental reports, and turn my family's property into her personal cash cow. Maggie's face had gone pale, but she rallied. "Mr. Morrison, you can't just make accusations." "You're right," I said, pulling out a thick folder. "I shouldn't make accusations. I should make criminal complaints." I held up the first document. Complaint number 1, mail fraud. You sent legal notices to an address you knew was vacant, then claimed I was unresponsive. Document 2. Complaint number 2, forgery. The environmental assessment for my property was signed by Eddie Kowalski, who never set foot on the land. Document 3. Complaint number 3, theft by conversion. You demolished my grandfather's cabin and built rental properties without permission or compensation. Document 4. Complaint number 4, tax fraud. You've been claiming community property exemptions while reporting rental income. By document 7, Maggie had stopped trying to interrupt. By document 10, people were pulling out their phones to record. By document 15, Marcus Webb was quietly heading for the exit. The total documented theft comes to approximately $300,000 in property value, rental income, and fraudulent assessments, I concluded. But that's just my property. Mrs. Thornfield has been running this scam on families all around the lake. Sarah stepped forward with her own folder. The Henderson family, forced out by $15,000 in fraudulent landscaping assessments. The Kowalski property, declared a fire hazard for code violations that don't exist. The Peterson place, condemned for structural problems that were later fixed with a $50 repair. The crowd was getting restless now, and not in Maggie's favor. These people were realizing they'd been cheering for a criminal enterprise. "Mrs. Thornfield," called out a voice from the back, "is this true? Have you been stealing people's property?" Maggie looked around the room like a cornered animal. "These are just misunderstandings. Legal complexities that can be resolved." "The only thing that's going to be resolved," I said, "is you returning every stolen property and paying damages to every family you've displaced." "And if she doesn't?" someone called out. Sarah smiled, that sharp smile I was learning to appreciate. "Then she'll have plenty of time to think about it in federal prison. Mail fraud carries a 20-year sentence." That's when the real chaos started. You know that moment in disaster movies when the dam finally breaks and everyone realizes the water's coming whether they're ready or not. That's what happened to Maggie's operation over the next 72 hours. By Friday morning, the story had gone local viral. Someone at the meeting had live-streamed my document presentation, and HOA Karen Steals Lake Property was trending on every community Facebook group within 50 miles. The video had that perfect combination of outrageous villainy and sweet justice that social media algorithms love. The comments section was brutal in the way only small-town internet justice can be. People were sharing their own HOA horror stories, posting pictures of Maggie's vacation rentals with captions like "Stolen Property Airbnb," and someone had created a Google Maps pin labeling the cottages as scene of the crime. But social media humiliation was just the appetizer. The main course was federal investigators showing up at Maggie's door with search warrants and very serious expressions. It turns out that mail fraud isn't one of those crimes the FBI takes lightly, especially when it's part of a multi-million-dollar property theft scheme. Sarah's carefully documented evidence had given them everything they needed for simultaneous raids on Maggie's home, Marcus Webb's law office, and the HOA's financial records. I got the play-by-play from Tommy Sullivan, who'd positioned himself across the street with a lawn chair and a cooler of beer to watch the show. FBI showed up at 7 a.m. sharp, he reported gleefully. 3 black SUVs, guys in suits carrying boxes of paperwork. Maggie came out in her bathrobe screaming about harassment and demanding to see warrants. They handed her a stack of papers thick as a phone book. The search lasted 6 hours. By the time they finished, they'd confiscated every computer, every file cabinet, and what appeared to be several boxes of cash that Maggie had been storing in her home office. Best part, Tommy continued, was when they brought out Marcus Webb in handcuffs. Man was crying like a baby, kept saying it was all Maggie's idea, and he was just following client instructions. Marcus Webb, criminal mastermind. The same guy who'd probably struggled to pass the bar exam, was now facing federal fraud charges. Sometimes justice has a sense of humor. The civil side of things moved even faster. With the criminal investigation providing cover, Sarah was able to file emergency injunctions freezing all of Willowbrook Property Management's assets. The vacation rentals were shut down immediately, leaving several very confused tourists wondering why their lakeside getaway had suddenly become a crime scene. By Monday, I was standing in my grandfather's property for the first time in 3 years, watching a crew dismantle the cottage rentals that had been built with stolen lumber on stolen land. The irony wasn't lost on me. Maggie had done such a good job with the construction that the materials would probably be worth more as salvage than my original cabin had been. But the real satisfaction came Tuesday morning when I got the call from Sarah. She's taking a plea deal, Sarah announced without preamble. Full restitution, asset forfeiture, and 5 years federal probation. Marcus is getting 2 years minimum security for his cooperation. What about the property? Full title restored to you and the other victims, plus damages. The cottages are yours to keep, demolish, or convert into the world's most expensive fishing shacks. Your choice. I walked down to the lake that evening, past the empty cottages that would soon be gone, past the fire pit where tourists had roasted marshmallows bought with my stolen rent money. The dock was still there, my grandfather's dock, reinforced but recognizable. The water looked the same as it had 3 years ago, dark green near the shore, shifting to deep blue toward the center, with that perfect stillness that only comes right before sunset. For a moment, I could almost hear my grandfather's voice. Boy, some folks spend their whole lives looking for trouble. Others just wait for trouble to find them, then deal with it proper. Maggie had definitely found trouble. The final tally of her empire was impressive in its scope. 7 stolen properties, over $2 million in fraudulent assessments and rental income, and a network of complicit officials that reached all the way to the county courthouse. Judge Patricia Fleming, it turned out, had been Marcus Webb's law school roommate and silent partner in several real estate ventures. She'd resigned in disgrace before the investigation could reach her chambers. The other victims were getting their properties back too. The Henderson family was already planning to replant their unauthorized vegetable garden, this time with heirloom tomatoes and a sign reading federally protected landscaping. The Kowalskis were throwing a block party to celebrate their house no longer being a fire hazard. Pete Sullivan was even considering moving back from Arizona, though he was still debating whether Michigan was far enough away from people like Maggie. The HOA itself was in complete meltdown. 4 of the 7 board members had resigned rather than face questioning about what they'd known and when they'd known it. The remaining 3 were busy trying to convince the community that they'd been deceived by Maggie's charismatic leadership and had no idea they'd been rubber stamping a criminal enterprise. "We trusted her," was the common refrain. She seemed so organized, so professional. Professional. There was that word again. Maggie had been professional right up until the moment she got caught. As for the cottages themselves, I'd made my decision. Instead of demolishing them, I was converting them into something Maggie had never intended, actual community assets. The first cottage would become a free retreat center for military families. The second would house a scholarship program for local kids who couldn't afford summer camp. The third would be a writer's retreat, because every small town needs at least one place where people can go to turn their trauma into best-selling memoirs. The fourth cottage, my personal favorite, was being converted into a legal aid clinic. Sarah had agreed to staff it pro bono 1 weekend a month, helping people who couldn't afford to fight HOA overreach on their own. We were calling it the Margaret Thornfield Memorial Center for Property Rights, Because sometimes the best revenge is making sure your enemy's name becomes synonymous with the cause they tried to destroy. The grand opening was scheduled for next month, right around the time Maggie would be starting her community service. 200 hours of picking up trash along the same lakefront she tried to steal. The judge had a sense of poetry. I'd kept one rental cottage running, though. Not for profit, for Pete. He'd been protecting my property when everyone else was too scared to stand up to Maggie, and he'd paid the price for his loyalty. The least I could do was make sure he had a place to stay whenever he wanted to visit the lake that had been his home for 40 years. As I sat there watching the sun set over water that was finally mine again, I thought about all the things Maggie had gotten wrong. She'd assumed I wouldn't come back. She'd assumed nobody would fight her. She'd assumed that fear was stronger than community, that greed was smarter than justice, that bureaucracy was more powerful than simple human decency. Most of all, she'd assumed that stealing someone's grandfather's land was just a business transaction. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. Local news wants to interview you about the case. You interested in being famous? I looked out over the lake, where a loon was calling in the distance, and the last light was painting everything gold. Fame could wait. I had a dock to sit on, a sunset to watch, and the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing that sometimes, just sometimes, the good guys actually win. Besides, I was pretty sure Maggie was getting plenty of fame all on her own. The kind that follows you around for the rest of your life, whispering about the time you tried to steal a lake and ended up losing everything instead. I texted Sarah back, maybe next week. Right now I'm busy being a property owner. The loon called again, and this time it sounded like laughter. 6 months later, the Willowbrook community is thriving in ways Maggie never imagined. Property values are up, not because of some sketchy rental scheme, but because word got out that this is the place where neighbors actually look out for each other. The waiting list for houses in the area is 3 months long. Maggie, meanwhile, is working as a night shift customer service representative for an insurance company. Apparently, her people skills and attention to detail make her perfect for explaining denied claims to angry policyholders. The irony writes itself. Marcus Webb is teaching paralegal courses at the community college, having discovered that prison gives you a lot of time to think about career changes. His course on ethics and legal practice is surprisingly popular, though students report that his examples tend toward the oddly specific. As for me, I'm back to building bridges, this time in Michigan, with a consulting firm that appreciates employees who understand the importance of solid foundations. The cottage project is expanding faster than we ever imagined, and Sarah's legal clinic has a waiting list of people who need help fighting their own HOA horror stories. And every evening, I sit on my grandfather's dock, watching the sunset and remembering his favorite piece of advice. Boy, there's two kinds of people in this world, those who build things up and those who tear things down. Make sure you know which kind you are. I know which kind I am. More importantly, I know which kind Maggie was. The difference is, I'm still here by the lake, and she's not. Sometimes that's justice enough. Thank you for being with us. Please share in the comments where you are watching from and whether you liked everything, and see you next time.